Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and utterly unglamorous world of the medieval knight. Those towering figures of legend clad in shining armor, riding into battle under banners of glory. While countless tales paint them as heroes, the stark truth is, being a medieval knight seriously sucked. So, before we dive into the history of the medieval knight, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always a joy to see how many people from around the world are ready for this journey. Now, dim the lights, close your eyes, feel your body deeply relax, leaving the tiring day behind. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you picture a medieval knight, images of gleaming armor, valiant charges, and chivalrous deeds likely come to mind. But beneath the polished steel and epic sagas, the reality was a brutal, often thankless existence. It wasn't just about glory and honor. It was a daily struggle against disease, brutal combat, and an unforgiving world where survival was never guaranteed. Picture this. You've just survived another skirmish, your armor dented, your body aching from the blows. You're not in a grand castle feast tonight. Instead, you're huddled in a damp, cold campaign tent, the ground hard beneath your thin sleeping roll. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool, stale sweat, and damp earth. Outside, the rain turns the camp into a muddy quagmire, and inside your tent, the chill seeps into your bones, a constant companion regardless of the meager fire. Nights were the worst. Sleep offered little respite from the gnawing hunger or the constant fear of an enemy raid. Every distant sound in the darkness brought a fresh wave of anxiety, reminding you that even in sleep, you were never truly safe. Yet, for all the mud and cold of a campaign, our collective memory often paints a very different picture of the medieval knight. We envision them not in a crude tent, but within the soaring stone walls of a magnificent castle, a beacon of strength and splendor. Imagine the grandeur, banners fluttering from turrets, tapestries adorning vast halls, the distant echo of jesters' laughter, and the rich aroma of a lavish feast. This is the image that has captured our imaginations for centuries, an era of seemingly boundless romance and adventure. Castles, in our minds, are not just fortresses, but vibrant centers of activity where noble families resided, their lives filled with pageantry and purpose. Picture the immense stone walls not merely for defense, but as a stage for power, a testament to the Lord's wealth and authority. Inside, the great hall would hum with life, servants moving purposefully, musicians playing their instruments, and the lord and lady holding court. Sunlight streaming through narrow arched windows, illuminating the rich colors of embroidered garments and the glint of polished silver on a well-laid table. This image suggests warmth, community, and the comforting security of a well-ordered world, far removed from the harshness of the outside. It's a place where stories were told, where poetry was recited, and where the knight, when not on campaign, enjoyed the fruits of his status, his days marked by the rhythms of courtly life and the promise of leisure. The knight himself, in this idealized vision, embodies the very best of human virtues. He adheres to the strict, beautiful tenets of chivalry, a code of conduct encompassing bravery in battle, courtesy towards women, generosity to the poor, and unwavering faith. He's depicted as a man of honor, whose word is his bond, who would never stoop to deceit or cruelty. He champions the innocent, defends the weak, and upholds justice with his mighty sword. This image of the parfait gentil knight is deeply ingrained, suggesting a moral purity and an almost spiritual dedication to good. He rides a magnificent warhorse, its barding adorned with his heraldic colors, a symbol of his family's long and noble lineage. He is the ultimate guardian, a beacon of light in a turbulent age, a figure of romance and heroic virtue, always ready to intervene on behalf of those who cannot defend themselves. Then there are the tournaments, those magnificent spectacles of skill and pageantry that truly bring the idealized knight to life. Imagine the brightly colored tents, the heralds announcing the challengers, the excited murmur of the crowd gathering in the stands, the thundering hooves of chargers as two armored knights, lances poised, gallop towards each other in a joust. The splintering wood, the gasp of the onlookers, the triumphant roar for the victor. These events were more than just martial exercises. They were grand social gatherings, opportunities for knights to display their prowess, win renown, and perhaps even catch the eye of a noble lady. They were a vivid, thrilling embodiment of medieval power and spectacle, where glory was won and legends were born, all under the approving gaze of royalty and a rapt audience, a celebration of martial excellence and courtly love. Beyond the battlefield and the tournament ground, the knight occupied an elevated position within the feudal hierarchy. He was not just a warrior, but a lord, often granted lands and tenants in exchange for his military service. This conferred upon him significant social status, wealth, and influence. People looked up to him, seeking his protection and guidance. His decisions, his whims, could shape the lives of entire villages. To be a knight meant to be part of the ruling elite, enjoying privileges and responsibilities that set him far apart from the common folk. He held court, administered justice in his domain, and his family name carried weight and prestige. He was seen as a guardian of the social order, a powerful figure whose life was filled with purpose and respect, a life many might aspire to. The very idea of knighthood conjures images of ancient lineage, noble deeds, and an unshakable place in society's upper echelons. This romanticized view, so carefully constructed over centuries, through epic poems, ballads, and later, through the lens of literature and film, is extraordinarily compelling. It speaks to a deep human desire for heroes, for order, and for an age where bravery and honor were paramount. We are invited to see the knight not as a flesh and blood man, burdened by the realities of his era, but as an almost mythical being. He is forever clad in gleaming, spotless armor, his sword always sharp, his resolve unyielding. He is well-fed, well-rested, and perpetually ready for the next noble quest or grand adventure. His life, a continuous stream of purpose, prestige, and well-deserved acclaim, a dream of what a hero should be. However, as we allow ourselves to sink deeper into the quiet hum of history, a gentle whisper begins to challenge these grand illusions. The golden sheen of legend, though beautiful, often obscures the rough, unpolished edges of reality. This serene landscape of noble castles and valiant deeds, while a comforting backdrop for our imaginations, was often a very demanding, precarious stage for those who lived within it. Our journey tonight will invite us to look beyond these magnificent tapestries, not to dismantle the romance entirely, but to carefully, thoughtfully reveal the often overlooked threads of hardship, the immense sacrifices, and the relentless, grim realities that ran through the very fabric of knightly existence. This deeper truth, far from being less compelling, is simply more human, more complex, and perhaps more profoundly insightful. It is in this nuanced understanding, this gentle contrast between the comforting golden legend and the demanding iron-hard truth, that we truly begin to comprehend why, for many who bore the title, being a medieval knight was a far cry from the fairy tale we've been told. It was a life that, beneath the glittering surface, often profoundly sucked, demanding a toll both physical and emotional that few could truly fathom. As the last echoes of those grand illusions fade, we are left with a more grounded understanding, one that leads us directly to the beginnings of a knight's life. The path to becoming one of these revered figures was not born of fairy tale magic, but forged in the crucible of grueling discipline and relentless sacrifice. It began not in the clash of heroic battles, but in the innocent, yet often heartbreaking, farewells of childhood. Imagine a boy, perhaps no older than 7 or 8, taken from his family home, from the warmth and familiarity of his mother's care, and sent to serve in the household of a noble lord or a more experienced knight. This wasn't a school trip or a summer camp. It was the first irreversible step into a life of perpetual training, servitude, and immense pressure. This young boy, now a page, was immediately immersed in a world of strict hierarchy and demanding expectations. His days were not filled with play, but with the practicalities of a lord's household. He would learn basic etiquette, serving at table, carrying messages, and assisting the ladies of the castle. But beneath these seemingly gentle tasks lay a deeper purpose: to learn humility, obedience, and the intricate social codes of the noble class. He would also receive rudimentary education, if lucky, learning to read and write a few prayers or simple accounts, though this was not universal. More importantly, he learned to handle a pony, to manage a hawk, and to begin the long, slow process of conditioning his body for the rigors to come. The castle, far from being a place of endless feasts, was a demanding school where every action was observed and every mistake could bring swift, often harsh, correction. Picture the chill of the stone floors, the constant hum of activity, the feeling of being a small, insignificant cog in a vast, unforgiving machine. As the page matured, typically around the age of 14, his training intensified dramatically, and he transitioned to the role of a squire. This was the true apprenticeship for knighthood, a period of intense physical and martial development that would push his body and mind to their absolute limits. His duties now shifted to directly serving a knight, becoming his constant companion and assistant. He would clean his master's armor, care for his horses, and accompany him into battle. This wasn't just about chores. It was about learning by doing, observing every nuance of warfare, strategy, and leadership from a seasoned warrior. The squire would spend hours each day in rigorous physical training, riding, wrestling, fencing, with blunted weapons, and practicing with a lance. He would carry increasingly heavy burdens, run long distances, and endure punishing exercises designed to build strength and endurance. The romantic image of a knight training with a graceful flourish quickly dissolves when we consider the sheer, repetitive grind of swinging heavy, blunted swords, practicing lance charges again and again, until his arms ached and his muscles screamed. Imagine yourself as that squire, your hands calloused, your muscles perpetually sore. You would rise before dawn, not to the gentle glow of a sunlit room, but to the cold, damp air of the castle stables, tasked with grooming a powerful warhorse that dwarfed you. The smell of hay and horse sweat would fill your nostrils, a constant reminder of the day's physical demands. Then, hours would be spent in the training yard, swinging a two-handed sword, each stroke a heavy, exhausting effort, aimed not at elegance, but at raw, brutal power. Or perhaps you'd be practicing with a lance, riding at a target, feeling the jarring impact as the heavy wooden weapon struck home, your entire body absorbing the shock. The weight of practice armor, though lighter than battle gear, would press down on you, restricting your movement, making every breath an effort. There was no easy day. Every moment was a test of resilience, a relentless preparation for a life where physical prowess could mean the difference between life and a brutal death. This grueling path was not accessible to everyone. The financial burden on a family hoping to see their son become a knight was immense, often crippling. Providing for a page's upkeep, then a squire's equipment, horses, armor, weapons, and even an education, required significant wealth. This meant that knighthood, while a path to status, was largely restricted to the already affluent gentry, rather than a true avenue for social mobility for the common person. Families would often sink deep into debt, sacrificing their own comfort and security, all in the hope that their son's eventual knighthood would bring honor and, crucially, continued land and influence. If the son failed, or worse, died before achieving his status, the financial ruin could be catastrophic. So even before the first real battle, the knight in training was already carrying a heavy burden, the hopes and financial security of his entire family. Furthermore, the basic education received by a page and squire, while sometimes including literacy, was primarily focused on military and courtly skills. The emphasis was on practical knowledge for survival and service, not on intellectual pursuits. Learning how to properly carve a roast or assist a lord in dressing was as crucial as understanding basic tactics. This meant that for many knights, their worldview remained relatively narrow, shaped by the demands of warfare and feudal obligations, rather than broad academic learning. Their training was a constant, all-encompassing indoctrination into a life of service, violence, and unwavering loyalty to their lord. It molded them not just into warriors, but into instruments of power, prepared to execute commands without question, ready to sacrifice their own comfort and well-being for the feudal system that sustained them. The glamour, the shining armor, these were distant dreams for a young man whose daily reality was defined by sweat, discipline, and the ever-present shadow of future combat. It was a rigorous, often unromantic foundation for a life that would prove far harsher than any legend suggested, and this was only the beginning of their trials. The training was endless, preparing them for one purpose: war. But even here, the reality starkly diverges from the epic tales. Our minds often conjure images of glorious charges, perfectly orchestrated maneuvers, and heroic duels fought with grace and precision. We picture knights, shining in their immaculate armor, effortlessly cutting through foes, their movements swift and decisive, their victories always assured. The cinematic battles show a dance of death, quick and almost elegant, a spectacle of valor where individual skill triumphs against overwhelming odds. This is the grand illusion, a captivating but deeply misleading portrayal of what it truly meant to confront the enemy on a medieval battlefield. The truth of medieval warfare, however, was a far grimmer, more chaotic, and brutally exhausting affair. Forget the swift, decisive strikes. Imagine instead a slow, grinding collision of heavily armed bodies, a struggle born more of endurance and brute force than agile footwork. The battlefield was often a muddy, uneven terrain, churned by thousands of feet and hooves, making any graceful movement almost impossible. Knights, encased in layers of steel, moved not with the fluidity of a dancer, but with the ponderous, deliberate steps of a man submerged in water. Each swing of a sword, each thrust of a spear was an immense physical effort, quickly draining strength and breath. The air would be thick with the groans of the wounded, the the clanging of steel, the shouts of commanders, and the terrifying, guttural cries of men fighting for their lives. It was not a ballet of blades, but a desperate, terrifying melee, where vision was obscured and fear was a constant, suffocating presence. Consider the primary weapons of the era: swords, lances, axes, and maces. These were not precision instruments of surgical strikes. They were tools of blunt, devastating impact, designed to crush, sever, and pierce. A sword, while iconic, was often heavy and unwieldy, more suited for hacking than elegant thrusting, especially against armored opponents. A lance, magnificent in a charge, was a one-time use weapon, often shattering on impact, leaving the knight to draw his secondary arms in the ensuing chaos. Axes and maces, often overlooked in romantic depictions, were terrifyingly effective against armor, delivering concussive blows that could break bones, shatter helmets, and cause internal injuries even without piercing the steel. The wounds inflicted were ghastly: compound fractures, deep lacerations, crushed skulls, and the horrific tearing of flesh. These were not clean, theatrical injuries, but messy, agonizing trauma that would often lead to slow, painful deaths from infection or blood loss. And what of the famed medieval armor, the gleaming symbol of knighthood? While offering significant protection, it was far from an invulnerable shield. A full suit of plate armor could weigh anywhere from 50 to 70 pounds, an immense burden to carry into active combat. It restricted movement, made hearing difficult, and perhaps most critically, was incredibly hot. Imagine fighting for hours under the relentless sun or in the suffocating confines of a helmet, sweat pouring down your face, your breath coming in ragged gasps. Dehydration and exhaustion were as much an enemy as the opposing army. While plate armor could deflect many blows, it still had vulnerable points: the joints, the visor slits, the gaps where pieces met. A well-aimed strike could find these weaknesses, or a sufficiently powerful blow could still transmit concussive force through the steel, causing internal injuries or simply knocking a man unconscious. It was protection, yes, but at a profound cost of mobility, comfort, and endurance. The sheer physicality demanded of a knight in battle is almost incomprehensible to us today. To wield heavy weapons for extended periods, to endure the weight of armor, to ride and fight simultaneously, all while surrounded by death and chaos, required not just strength, but an almost superhuman level of stamina. Imagine being jostled, pushed, and pulled in the dense formations, your every muscle strained, your lungs burning for air. The fight was often not about defeating an enemy with a single heroic blow, but about simply staying upright, continuing to swing, and surviving the maelstrom of bodies and blades. The glorious charge depicted in films was only the opening act, quickly dissolving into an exhausting hand-to-hand struggle that could last for hours. There was no time for rest, no moment of calm, only the relentless, brutal pressure of combat, pushing a knight to the very edge of his physical and mental limits. The impact of such combat extended far beyond the battlefield itself. Even if a knight survived, the physical toll was immense. Chronic pain from old wounds, broken bones that never healed correctly, and the cumulative damage to joints and muscles would be a constant companion. Many would carry the scars of battle, visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. These were not just badges of honor, they were reminders of the constant suffering and the precariousness of their existence. The brutal reality of medieval warfare stripped away any romantic notions, revealing a life where glory was fleeting, but pain, exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of a gruesome end were the true, enduring hallmarks of a knight's experience. While the open battlefield presented its own immediate, brutal dangers, a knight's experience of war was far more often defined by a different, equally terrifying, and perhaps even more insidious form of conflict: the siege. Forget the grand, sweeping charges of cavalry, the clang of swords in open combat. For every pitched battle, there were countless sieges, protracted affairs that tested endurance, patience, and the very limits of human suffering. A siege was a slow, deliberate act of strangulation, an attempt to starve out, wear down, and psychologically break an enemy behind their formidable walls. Conversely, for those inside, it was an arduous, desperate struggle to hold out against an overwhelming force, often with dwindling resources and fading hope. It was a war of waiting, of attrition, where the greatest enemy was often not the opposing soldier, but the creeping despair, the insidious advance of disease, and the gnawing hunger that became constant companions for both attackers and defenders. Imagine yourself as a knight, not charging gloriously under a fluttering banner, but instead camped for months, perhaps even a year or more, outside a formidable stone castle. Your days would stretch into a monotonous cycle of arduous labor, digging extensive trenches, constructing massive siege engines like trebuchets and battering rams, and maintaining a constant, exhausting vigil. The encampments themselves, hastily constructed and often poorly managed, quickly devolved into breeding grounds for unspeakable filth. Picture the ground beneath your feet, perpetually churned into a thick, clinging mud by incessant rains and the relentless movement of thousands of men and horses. This mud would be saturated with human and animal waste, creating an overpowering, pervasive stench that would cling to everything: your clothes, your armor, your very skin, seeping into your lungs with every breath. Sanitation, as we understand it today, was practically non-existent. Water sources were often contaminated by the sheer proximity of so many bodies and their waste, and personal hygiene was a luxury few could afford or maintain amidst the grim realities of a long campaign. This was not the noble setting of a hero, but the grim, unromantic reality of a soldier's camp, a place where the comfort, dignity, and indeed the very health of life were systematically eroded by the sheer squalor. In such abject conditions, disease was not an exception. It was an expectation, a silent, pervasive killer far more efficient and indiscriminate than any sword. Dysentery, a horrifying affliction of constant debilitating diarrhea, would sweep through the crowded ranks of both besiegers and besieged alike, weakening men to the point of collapse and rendering them unfit for duty. Smallpox, typhus, and a myriad of other fevers would claim lives with ruthless efficiency, often spreading faster among the crowded, unhygienic populations than any enemy arrow or projectile. Even a minor wound, a simple cut from a stray branch or a poorly fitting piece of armor, could quickly turn gangrenous in the absence of antiseptic knowledge, leading to agonizing infection, necessary amputation, or a slow, painful death. You might survive a skirmish on the walls unscathed, only to succumb to a virulent fever that left you shivering, delirious, and utterly helpless, miles from any real medical care, if such care even existed. The constant, adrenaline-fueled fear of battle was thus compounded by the equally constant, and perhaps even more insidious, fear of falling ill, knowing that sickness could be a death sentence just as surely as a blade to the throat or a stone to the head. Beyond the profound physical discomfort and the ever-present threat of disease, the psychological toll of a prolonged siege was immense, gnawing at the very spirit of the combatants. For the attacking knight, there was the crushing weight of endless boredom, stretching over weeks and months, punctuated only by sudden, brief moments of intense, terrifying action. Weeks of monotonous inaction, broken only by a sudden, desperate sortie from the castle's defenders, or the arduous, back-breaking task of laboriously moving a massive trebuchet into position under the constant threat of enemy fire. The relentless need for vigilance, the constant fear of a surprise attack under the cover of darkness, the ever-present sense of waiting for something, anything, to happen, all these factors slowly, subtly chipped away at mental fortitude, leading to exhaustion, irritability, and a profound sense of futility. For those inside the besieged castle walls, the experience was perhaps even more harrowing, a living nightmare of confinement and dread. Imagine being cooped up day after day, week after week, watching your dwindling food and water supplies with growing alarm. Picture the sheer psychological pressure of listening to the relentless, rhythmic pounding of enemy siege engines against your walls, feeling the very foundations of your sanctuary tremble, or hearing the terrifying, bone-rattling thud of a massive stone projectile crashing into your courtyard. The fear of starvation was not an abstract concept, but a grim, creeping reality, forcing defenders and civilians alike to eat whatever could be found: rats, horses, meager scraps of grain. As the hope of relief from outside forces faded with each passing sunset, the psychological pressure of knowing your family, your friends, and your entire community were also trapped, equally vulnerable, equally suffering, would have been a suffocating, almost unbearable burden, a torment far worse than any physical wound. The tactics employed in siege warfare were a brutal testament to human desperation and ingenuity, far removed from the chivalrous duels of popular imagination. Attackers would attempt to undermine walls, digging elaborate tunnels beneath them to collapse the very foundations of the stronghold, a terrifying prospect for those within, who could hear the muffled sounds of digging beneath their feet, knowing their world could collapse at any moment. Massive catapults and trebuchets hurled not just stones, but sometimes disease-ridden animal carcasses, human waste, or even the severed heads of captured enemies over the walls, aiming to spread terror, demoralization, and sickness amongst the besieged. Defenders in turn would respond with equally ruthless measures, pouring boiling oil, molten lead, or noxious substances onto those attempting to scale ladders or breach the gates. Volleys of arrows and crossbow bolts would rain down indiscriminately. The brutality was absolute, with little quarter given, as the stakes were existential, survival itself. Capture often meant torture, mutilation, a life of slavery, or a swift, ignominious execution. There was no glory in the stench of death, the cries of the starving, or the sickening thud of a projectile. Only the grim, relentless determination to survive, by any means necessary, in a conflict that devoured both body and soul. Can you truly imagine being immersed in such an environment? Not just as a detached observer of history, but as a living, breathing participant? The pervasive, inescapable smell of fear, decay, and unwashed bodies? The hollow, burning ache in your stomach from perpetual hunger, gnawing at your resolve? The constant, insidious anxiety that every single day could be your last? That a sudden breach in the walls, a successful mining operation, or simply the ravages of illness, could bring about a brutal, agonizing end for you and everyone you knew. This was the true face of medieval siege warfare, a grinding, dehumanizing ordeal that systematically stripped away any romantic veneer of knighthood, revealing a deeper, more profound layer of suffering, endurance, and the quiet, relentless horror of a warrior's life. The slow, incessant pressure of a siege redefined what it meant to endure, pushing men far beyond what they believed themselves capable of, leaving an indelible mark, both physical and psychological, that no amount of eventual victory or tales of glory could ever truly erase. And this, perhaps more than any other aspect of their martial lives, was a common, enduring reason why life for a medieval knight so often truly sucked. The previous blocks have taken us through the harsh training and brutal realities of medieval warfare, both in open battle and the grinding horror of sieges. Now, as the sounds of clashing steel and the cries of the battlefield begin to recede, we turn our attention to an equally profound, yet often overlooked aspect of a knight's existence, their daily life, the moments not defined by combat or grand courtly affairs. If you've imagined a knight returning to a life of serene comfort and lavish indulgence after a campaign, prepare for another layer of disillusionment, for even in times of peace or in the perceived security of a castle, the medieval knight's reality was a far cry from the opulent scenes often depicted. It was a life deeply intertwined with discomfort, pervasive unsanitary conditions, and a constant battle against the most mundane, yet persistent, adversaries. Let's first confront the uncomfortable truth about medieval hygiene, or rather the stark absence of it. The romantic image often bypasses the very real, very human aspect of cleanliness. In an age before plumbing, before readily available soap, and before a scientific understanding of germs, personal hygiene was rudimentary at best. Imagine living in a world where regular full-body bathing was a rare event, often undertaken only a few times a year, typically for special occasions or religious rituals. Daily washing, when it occurred, might involve a quick rinse of hands and face with cold water, certainly not the thorough cleansing we consider essential today. Clothes were rarely washed and often worn for weeks, if not months, accumulating sweat, grime, and the odors of daily life. The result, inevitably, was a pervasive lack of personal freshness. If you were to step back in time and stand among a group of medieval knights, the first thing you would likely notice, long before their gleaming armor, would be the overpowering composite smell of unwashed bodies, stale clothing, and the lingering scent of smoke, sweat, and unidentifiable organic matter. It's a sensory detail often omitted from our heroic narratives, but one that would have been an undeniable, constant presence for anyone living in that era, making even social interactions a far less pleasant affair than our imaginations might suggest. This lack of personal hygiene was compounded by a broader problem of poor sanitation within castles and settlements. While a castle might appear majestic from afar, a closer inspection would reveal a startling lack of modern waste management. Human and animal waste was often simply thrown into moats, pits, or even directly into the streets outside the castle walls, creating open sewers that festered and attracted pests. Even within the castle, the concept of a dedicated lavatory with efficient waste disposal was rare. Garderobes, or latrines, were essentially chutes built into the castle walls, dropping waste directly into the moat or a cesspit below. While a practical solution for the time, they were far from odorless and certainly contributed to the overall pervasive stench of medieval life. The air, particularly in warmer months, would have been heavy with the smells of decay, stagnant water, and human effluvia. This constant exposure to unsanitary conditions wasn't just unpleasant, it was a direct pipeline for disease, a silent killer that stalked every corner of medieval existence, indiscriminately claiming lives. even those of the powerful and privileged knights who thought themselves secure within their stone fortresses. Beyond the visible dirt and pervasive odors, the medieval world was teeming with unseen and often seen inhabitants that made daily life a constant irritation. Parasites and pests, fleas and lice were an inescapable reality for virtually everyone, regardless of their social standing. Imagine the constant, maddening itch that would accompany you everywhere, day and night, in your clothes, in your hair, in your bedding. These tiny, blood-sucking creatures were not just a nuisance. They were vectors for disease, transmitting everything from typhus to the plague. Rats and mice scurried through the castle walls and great halls, drawn by food scraps and poor waste disposal, carrying their own menagerie of diseases. Bugs, flies, and other insects were also ubiquitous, especially in the warmer months, swarming around food, landing on exposed skin, and generally adding to the pervasive discomfort. A knight's armor, designed to protect him from human foes, offered no defense against these microscopic or minute invaders, who were often the more persistent and unavoidable enemy. Sleeping, eating, sitting, conversing, every aspect of daily life would have been punctuated by the subtle or not so subtle irritation of these unwanted companions, a constant reminder of the raw, untamed nature of their existence. Now, let's consider the medieval diet. Forget the lavish, multi-course feasts with roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet wines that often grace fictional portrayals of courtly life. While such feasts did occur on rare, special occasions, they were far from the daily reality for most, even for a knight. The everyday diet of a knight, particularly when on campaign or residing in a more remote castle, was often bland, repetitive, and frequently insufficient. Staples included coarse bread, often made from rye or barley, which was hard and difficult to digest, stews made with whatever vegetables were available, and perhaps a small amount of preserved meat or fish formed the bulk of many meals. Fresh meat and produce were seasonal luxuries, and preservation methods were crude, relying heavily on salt, drying, or smoking, which significantly altered the taste and nutritional value of food. Spices were incredibly expensive and reserved for the wealthiest tables, or for disguising the taste of meat that was beginning to spoil. Hunger, far from being a stranger, was a frequent and unwelcome visitor. Famine was a recurring threat throughout the medieval period, brought on by bad harvests, prolonged wars, or natural disasters. Even in good times, food supply could be inconsistent. Imagine the gnawing sensation in your stomach, the persistent dull ache of not being truly full day after day. A knight, despite his elevated status, was not immune to these realities. On campaign, supplies could be meager, dependent on what could be scavenged, captured, or transported over difficult terrain. The concept of a balanced diet was unknown, and many suffered from various nutritional deficiencies, impacting their energy levels, their ability to heal, and their overall physical and mental well-being. The image of a strong, vibrant warrior effortlessly performing feats of strength fades when we consider the reality of a diet lacking in essential vitamins and nutrients, leaving one constantly tired, vulnerable to illness, and struggling to maintain peak physical condition. The simple pleasure of a satisfying, varied meal was a rare indulgence, not a daily expectation, adding another layer of quiet, persistent hardship to the knight's life. This unglamorous reality of hygiene, sanitation, pests, and diet painted a picture of daily discomfort that underpins the romantic facade of knighthood. It was a life lived in close quarters with unaddressed bodily odors, the constant crawl of insects, and the dull, ever-present ache of hunger. These were not the challenges of honor or glory, but the relentless, mundane trials that eroded comfort and well-being. They were the silent battles fought every single day, battles against the very conditions of their existence, leaving little room for the idealized notions of a pristine, noble life. In part 2 of our look at daily life, we will continue to explore the physical and psychological toll of medieval living, venturing beyond the basic necessities into the very fabric of their everyday environment and its inescapable hardships. Continuing our journey into the unvarnished truth of a knight's daily existence, we move beyond the issues of personal hygiene and sustenance to explore the deeper, often psychological, discomforts that pervaded their lives, even in times considered peaceful. For a knight, the concept of true peace was a fleeting illusion, often replaced by a pervasive monotony punctuated by the constant undercurrent of threat and the gnawing ache of isolation. Imagine the routine of a knight stationed in a remote border castle, far from the bustling courts or the perceived glamour of tournaments. Day after day, the same stone walls, the same faces, the same watch rotations. The sun rises and sets over an unchanging landscape, bringing with it the same duties: patrolling the perimeter, inspecting defenses, training with the few men under his command, or perhaps overseeing the mundane agricultural work of his domain. The hours would drag, filled with a repetitive rhythm that could easily breed a profound sense of tedium. This wasn't the heroic idleness of a warrior resting on his laurels, but the quiet, relentless hum of a life on hold, waiting for something to happen, often for years on end. The romantic notion of a knight's life rarely includes the sheer, soul-crushing boredom that would inevitably accompany long stretches of uneventful garrison duty. This monotony was often compounded by a profound sense of isolation. Knights, especially those of lesser status or those garrisoned in distant outposts, spent vast stretches of their lives separated from their families. A young knight might have left his childhood home as a page and seen his family only intermittently for the rest of his life. Marriages were often strategic alliances, and even when a family resided in the castle, the knight's duties could take him away for months or even years on campaign. Imagine the emotional toll of such prolonged separation, the yearning for familiar faces, for the comfort of domesticity, for conversations that weren't solely about war, duty, or the daily management of a meager estate. Letters were rare and slow, if they arrived at all. News of loved ones might take months to reach him, or worse, not at all, leaving him to wonder, to worry, and to feel utterly disconnected from the personal bonds that define human existence. The image of the lone knight riding through the wilderness, often romanticized, was in reality a stark reflection of his emotional solitude. Moreover, even within the confines of a castle, there was a constant, almost primal need for vigilance. The medieval world was a dangerous place, even without an active war. Banditry was rife, feuds between lords were common, and rebellions could erupt without warning. A knight was, first and foremost, a guardian, and this role demanded an unceasing alertness. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Every distant sound in the night could signal danger. Sleep, even when it came, was rarely deep and restorative. The mind of a knight would always be on a low-level alert, accustomed to listening for alarm bells, to the subtle changes in the wind, to the muffled sounds of approaching horses. This constant state of readiness, this inability to truly let down one's guard, would have been a profound psychological burden, contributing to chronic stress, anxiety, and an inability to ever truly feel secure. The idea of peace for a knight often meant merely a temporary cessation of overt warfare, not a genuine reprieve from the omnipresent sense of danger. Then there was the constant, pervasive physical discomfort stemming from their environment and their very attire. Medieval castles, for all their impressive stone walls, were far from cozy. They were designed for defense, not comfort. Imagine the relentless cold during winter months, the dampness that seeped into everything, and the incessant drafts that whistled through ill-fitting windows and doors. Heating was provided by inefficient fireplaces, which offered warmth only in their immediate vicinity, leaving most of the vast stone halls and private chambers frigid and uninviting. Clothing, while often layered, was made of coarse wool or linen, heavy and restrictive. Even the seemingly simpler garments worn daily would have felt cumbersome compared to modern clothing, and the absence of effective insulation meant that maintaining a comfortable body temperature was a constant struggle. Sleeping arrangements were equally rudimentary. Beds were often simple wooden frames with straw mattresses, frequently shared and rarely changed. The straw itself could harbor fleas and lice, as we discussed, adding to the discomfort. The noise of a working castle, even at night, guards on patrol, the rustling of animals, the creaking of timbers, meant that undisturbed sleep was a luxury. Imagine wrapping yourself in scratchy wool blankets in a cold, damp room, listening to the wind howl through a gap in the stone, your body never quite warm, your muscles never fully relaxing. Even when a knight was not on campaign, his home was a fortress, and a fortress prioritizes security over the soft embrace of comfort. Even the experience of travel, which was a frequent necessity for knights journeying between estates, to court, or to war, was an ordeal in itself. Roads were poorly maintained, often no more than muddy tracks, making travel slow, jarring, and exhausting. Riding a horse for days or weeks on end, exposed to the elements, scorching sun, driving rain, biting winds, would take an immense toll on the body. A knight's saddle was his office, and his horse his only constant companion for long stretches. The jolting motion, the constant awareness of surroundings, the endless expanse of the road ahead, all contributed to a deep physical fatigue that even the most hardened warrior could not escape. The romantic image of a knight effortlessly galloping through picturesque landscapes belies the reality of sore muscles, saddle sores, and the relentless exposure to an often unforgiving environment. So, when we speak of a knight's daily life, we must carefully redefine what that truly meant. It was not a life of effortless leisure or constant adventure. It was a life characterized by enduring discomfort, by the quiet struggle against the elements, against unseen pests, against the gnawing pangs of hunger and the subtle erosion of the spirit by monotony and isolation. The heavy, unyielding stone of their castles, the coarse fabric of their clothes, the endless stretches of unstimulating guard duty, and the perpetual readiness for unseen threats, all combined to form a reality far removed from the polished tales. These were the mundane, yet profoundly impactful hardships that formed the bedrock of a knight's existence, making even his moments of peace a test of his resilience, a persistent reminder that his life, beneath the veneer of status, was often one of profound and inescapable discomfort. This pervasive, low-level suffering, a constant companion, shaped their character, hardened their resolve, and contributed significantly to why, for so many, being a medieval knight was an undeniably difficult and often unpleasant experience. Day in and day out. The knight's life, as we've explored, was a ceaseless battle against physical discomforts, the grim realities of war, and the pervasive lack of hygiene. Yet, beneath the visible layers of steel and inherited status, lay another, perhaps even more insidious, adversary, the relentless pressure of financial burdens. For many, knighthood was not merely a calling to arms, but a venture fraught with immense economic risk, a constant balancing act between perceived wealth and crippling debt. The romantic image of a knight, self-sufficient and eternally prosperous, quickly dissolves when confronted with the actual balance sheets of medieval aristocracy. Consider first the sheer cost of simply existing as a knight, let alone campaigning. The very tools of his trade were exorbitantly expensive. A full suit of plate armor, meticulously crafted by skilled artisans, could cost as much as a small farm or an entire village's annual income. This wasn't a one-time purchase. Armor required constant maintenance, repairs from battle damage, and often upgrades as technology evolved. Imagine the dents and gouges after a skirmish, each one a costly repair. Then there were the weapons. A finely made sword, a sturdy lance, a functional shield, all represented significant investments. These items were not cheap. They were the equivalent of today's high-performance military equipment, demanding a fortune to acquire and preserve. And without them, a knight was simply a man, vulnerable and without his identity. Beyond his personal gear, a knight's most crucial asset was his warhorse, a magnificent animal specifically bred and trained for combat. These destriers were powerful, agile, and incredibly expensive, often costing as much as, or even more than, a suit of armor. Maintaining such an animal, feeding it, stabling it, paying for its care, and replacing it if it died in battle, was a colossal ongoing expense. A knight might also need multiple horses, a palfrey for travel, a pack horse for baggage, adding to the financial drain. The loss of a warhorse in battle was not just a strategic setback. It was a devastating financial blow, potentially setting a knight back years or forcing him into a perilous economic situation. Furthermore, a knight rarely rode to war alone. He was expected to bring a retinue of his own. This often included at least one squire and sometimes several men-at-arms or archers, all of whom needed to be equipped, fed, and paid, however meagerly. These retainers were essential for his effectiveness in battle and for projecting his authority, but their upkeep represented a significant, non-negotiable expense. The more powerful the knight, the larger his retinue, and consequently, the greater his financial outgoings. This wasn't a choice, it was an expectation, a social and military obligation that placed an enormous burden on a knight's often limited resources. His wealth was not simply for his own lavish living, but a critical resource that had to be constantly poured back into maintaining his status and military readiness. One of the most terrifying financial threats for a medieval knight was the prospect of capture. If a knight was taken prisoner in battle, he would often be held for ransom. This wasn't a barbaric act of simple cruelty. It was a highly organized, albeit brutal, economic system. The value of a knight, tied to his status, family, and lands, would be assessed, and a ransom demand would be sent to his family or liege lord. These sums could be astronomical, often requiring the sale of lands, the mortgaging of estates, or the liquidation of every available asset. Families could be utterly bankrupted trying to secure the release of a captured loved one. Imagine the agonizing choice. Abandon your family member to a potentially brutal fate, or sacrifice your entire ancestral holding, stripping your lineage of its foundation. Many knights spent years in captivity, or were utterly ruined upon their release, returning to a life of destitution and diminished status, all because of the single misfortune of being captured. The constant specter of ransom was a psychological weight, adding another layer of deep anxiety to every battle. Beyond these direct military costs, feudal obligations imposed a constant financial drain. A knight held his land, and thus his status, in exchange for service to a higher lord. This service wasn't just military, it often involved financial contributions, taxes, and levies to support his lord's court, campaigns, or even personal expenses. He might be required to host his lord and his retinue, a costly affair that could quickly deplete his stores. There were also the costs associated with administering justice, maintaining local infrastructure, and supporting the church within his domain. These were not optional expenses, but the fundamental duties of his position, failures in which could lead to severe repercussions. The concept of free land was a myth. Every acre came with a price, a complex web of duties and financial commitments that tied a knight tightly to his feudal overlord. The relentless pressure to maintain appearances, to project an image of wealth and power that often belied the true state of his finances, was another significant burden. A knight was expected to live up to his status, to host guests, to participate in tournaments, which themselves were costly affairs with entry fees, new equipment and prizes, and to generally present himself as a figure of authority and prosperity. Failing to do so could lead to a loss of respect, influence, and potentially the very lands he held. The ever-present threat of losing land, title, or even knighthood due to financial ruin was a terrifying reality. A series of bad harvests, a costly war, or an unfortunate ransom could quickly spiral into economic catastrophe, leaving a knight and his family destitute, effectively erasing generations of accumulated status and privilege. The psychological impact of this constant financial anxiety cannot be overstated. Imagine the internal conflict, the need to appear strong and unflappable while constantly battling the fear of insolvency. Every expenditure, every harvest, every rumor of war would be viewed through the lens of economic survival. This silent, gnawing worry was a constant companion, undermining the very sense of security that knighthood was supposed to provide. The weight of debt, the precariousness of their financial situation, and the ever-present risk of economic collapse added a profound, unromantic layer of stress to the lives of medieval knights, making their existence far more about managing survival than simply pursuing glory. This was a hidden struggle, fought not with sword and shield, but with ledger books and the constant cold calculations of a world where financial solvency was as vital as courage in battle. It was yet another reason why, for many, the life of a medieval knight was far from the golden dream. Our journey through the medieval knight's demanding world has thus far revealed layers of hardship, from the grueling training that began in childhood, through the brutal chaos of open battle and the soul-crushing monotony of sieges, to the persistent discomforts of daily life and the gnawing anxieties of financial ruin. Yet there was another adversary, perhaps the most relentless and indiscriminate of all, one that stalked every man, woman, and child in the medieval era, regardless of their station: disease and the ever-present shadow of death. For the medieval knight, despite his armor and his martial prowess, was utterly defenseless against the silent, invisible enemies that lurked in every shadow, every cup of water, and every breath of air. Life in the Middle Ages was inherently precarious, a constant struggle against a host of ailments that would be easily treatable today, but were then often fatal. Diseases like dysentery, a terrifying affliction that caused severe diarrhea and dehydration, would sweep through armies and populations with devastating speed, leaving a trail of weakness and death. Smallpox, with its distinctive pustules and high mortality rate, was another common scourge, disfiguring survivors and claiming countless lives. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, while a specific catastrophic event, was but one of many plagues that periodically decimated communities, leaving no one, not even the most powerful knight, truly safe. These were not abstract threats. They were a pervasive, intimate reality, often claiming more lives than all the battles combined. Imagine watching your comrades, or even members of your own family, succumb to a mysterious illness, their bodies racked with fever, their strength draining away, knowing there was nothing you or anyone else could truly do to stop it. The very conditions of medieval life, as we have touched upon, created a fertile breeding ground for such maladies. The poor sanitation within castles and towns, the contaminated water sources, the lack of personal hygiene, and the constant presence of vermin, rats, fleas, and lice, all contributed to an environment where pathogens could thrive and spread unchecked. A knight returning from campaign, often having spent months in unsanitary siege camps or on muddy battlefields, was particularly vulnerable. Even a seemingly minor cut or scrape sustained in battle or even during a training exercise could quickly become infected. Without any understanding of bacteria or antiseptics, such wounds could fester, turn gangrenous, and lead to agonizing, slow deaths, or require brutal amputations without anesthesia, with survival far from guaranteed. The simple act of living was a perilous endeavor, and the concept of medical comfort, as we understand it, was a distant, unimaginable dream. And when illness or injury inevitably struck, the state of medieval medicine offered little in the way of effective relief, and often actively caused more harm than good. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, a curious blend of ancient Greek and Roman texts, folk remedies, and a heavy dose of superstition and religious belief. Physicians, often educated in monasteries, might rely on practices like humoral theory, believing that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments often involved bloodletting, using leeches or incisions to drain blood, or purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, all in an attempt to rebalance these humors. While some herbal remedies did possess genuine medicinal properties, their application was often haphazard, and the true cause of disease remained a mystery. On the battlefield, the surgeons were often barbers or blacksmiths, possessing practical, if brutal, skills. Their primary role was to stop bleeding, set broken bones, and, if necessary, amputate limbs. Imagine the horror of such an operation. A conscious patient held down by strong men, enduring the agony of a limb being sawn off without any form of effective pain relief beyond perhaps a swig of strong alcohol or a quick blow to the head. Post-operative care was almost non-existent. Wounds were often dressed with unclean bandages, and the importance of cleanliness was not understood, meaning infection was an almost guaranteed consequence. Many who survived the initial trauma of battle would later succumb to the secondary effects of infection, their bodies slowly poisoned from within. The healing process was often as terrifying, if not more so, than the injury itself. Even for those powerful knights with access to the best available care, recovery was a long, arduous, and uncertain journey. The constant threat of relapse, of a wound reopening, or of a new fever taking hold was a persistent anxiety. A knight might survive countless battles, only to be felled by a simple stomach ailment, a sudden fever, or an infected tooth. This pervasive vulnerability, this constant dance with death, stripped away any illusion of invincibility that armor or status might confer. It was a stark, daily reminder of the fragility of human life in an era where the most advanced medical science amounted to little more than educated guesswork and desperate measures. The life of a medieval knight, therefore, was not merely about facing the spears and arrows of human enemies, but about enduring the invisible onslaught of disease, the terrifying inefficiency of their own medicine, and the ever-present cold embrace of an early grave. This constant companionship of illness and death added yet another profound layer to why their existence was so undeniably harsh, a constant test of physical endurance and a quiet acceptance of mortality that we, in our modern world of antibiotics and advanced surgery, can scarcely comprehend. As we journey deeper into the intricate tapestry of a knight's life, we find ourselves at a crossroads where the shimmering threads of legend often intertwine with the coarse, unyielding fibers of historical reality. We have explored the physical hardships, the relentless training, the brutal combat, the pervasive disease that marked their existence. Now, our gaze turns to a concept perhaps more central to the knightly mythos than any other: the code of chivalry. When we speak of medieval knights, we often conjure images of unblemished virtue, of noble warriors guided by an unwavering moral compass, brave, courteous, honorable, and fiercely protective of the weak and innocent. This idealized code, emphasizing valor, piety, loyalty, and courtesy, has been immortalized in countless tales, poems, and romantic sagas, painting a picture of men striving for an almost saintly moral perfection in a brutal world. It suggests a time when honor was paramount, and a knight's word was his unbreakable bond. Yet, as with so many aspects of the medieval world, the gap between this lofty ideal and the gritty, often brutal reality of a knight's behavior was vast, a chasm frequently ignored by romanticized accounts. While the code of chivalry certainly existed as an aspirational framework, it was more often a fluid concept, selectively applied and frequently overridden by the harsh exigencies of power, survival, and self-interest. For every tale of a knight defending the vulnerable, there are countless historical records of their less than chivalrous actions, particularly towards those outside their own social sphere. The common folk, the peasants, the merchants, these were often viewed not as subjects to be protected, but as resources to be exploited, or worse, as targets for unbridled aggression. Consider the reality of medieval warfare, not in the grand strategic sense, but in its brutal local impact. Knights, with their military training and weaponry, often acted with impunity in conquered territories, or during campaigns in enemy lands. Pillage, the systematic looting of villages and towns, was a common, indeed expected, part of warfare, often encouraged to supplement meager pay or simply to sustain a campaign. Livestock would be seized, crops burned, homes ransacked, and any valuables taken. The romantic image of a knight protecting villagers crumbles when confronted with the reality of those same knights being the agents of their terror and impoverishment. The courtesy of chivalry rarely extended to those who could not offer ransom or political advantage, revealing a stark class divide in the application of their supposed moral code. One of the darkest and most uncomfortable truths hidden beneath the veneer of chivalry is the pervasive issue of sexual violence. Despite the romanticized notion of knights as protectors of women, historical accounts reveal a grim reality where rape and sexual assault were lamentably common occurrences, particularly during wartime or periods of social upheaval. Noble women might be offered some protection within their own class and family networks, but for peasant women and those caught in the chaos of battle or siege, there was often little recourse. The code of chivalry, in practice, frequently failed to extend its protective arm to all women, and indeed was often utterly disregarded by men who held positions of power and privilege, further exposing the hypocrisy and selective application of its tenets. This is a difficult truth, one that stands in stark contrast to the ballads and legends, and yet it is an essential part of understanding the full, unvarnished reality of the medieval knight. Furthermore, the concept of honor for a medieval knight was often far less about universal moral good and much more about personal reputation, loyalty to one's liege lord, and the pragmatic pursuit of power and land. Oaths of fealty, while sworn before God, were frequently broken when political winds shifted or a better opportunity arose. Knights might switch allegiances, betray former allies, or engage in ruthless power struggles against their own kinsmen. The feudal landscape was rife with examples of betrayal, shifting loyalties, and internecine warfare, all driven by ambition, greed, or the desire for greater influence. The very concept of treachery was often viewed through a highly contextual lens. What was betrayal to one lord might be considered pragmatic self-preservation or clever maneuver by another. This fluid morality stands in stark opposition to the image of an unyielding, morally absolute paragon of virtue. The harsh realities of the medieval world themselves often provided a brutal justification, or at least a strong impetus for these unchivalrous acts. In an era of constant warfare, limited resources, and precarious existence, survival and the maintenance of one's power and lineage often superseded abstract moral codes. A knight might pillage to feed his men, or break an oath to secure a more powerful alliance that ensured the survival of his own domain. The pursuit of personal wealth, land, and influence was not merely an act of greed, but often a necessity for maintaining one's status and protecting one's family in a fiercely competitive and unforgiving social structure. Honor, in this context, was less about lofty ideals and more about demonstrating strength, securing loyalty, and effectively wielding power, even if it meant resorting to methods that, by our modern sensibilities, seem utterly antithetical to the romantic notion of chivalry. So, as we gently pull back the veil of centuries of romanticized storytelling, we are left with a more complex and perhaps more profoundly human understanding of the code of chivalry. It was not a universally observed moral law, but rather an ideal, often honored in rhetoric more than in practice. Knights, far from being pristine embodiments of virtue, were men of their time, products of a brutal feudal system that often demanded ruthlessness and pragmatism over abstract morality. They were capable of immense bravery and loyalty, yes, but also of profound cruelty, self-interest, and a selective application of their own vaunted code. This nuanced perspective, devoid of the glittering illusions, allows us to see them not as mythical heroes, but as real individuals grappling with the demands of their era, striving for glory and survival in a world that often rewarded cunning and force far more readily than it did gentility and mercy. It is in this challenging of the myth that we truly begin to comprehend why, even in matters of honor and conduct, the life of a medieval knight was often deeply, uncomfortably, and unromantically difficult. This deeper truth is not meant to diminish their historical significance, but to enrich our understanding of the profound complexities and inherent contradictions of their existence. It is a vital step in our journey to truly grasp why their lives so often, in their own harsh way, truly sucked. Our journey has taken us through the demanding life of a medieval knight, peeling back the layers of romanticized myth to reveal a reality steeped in hardship, brutal combat, and constant struggle. We've witnessed their grueling training, the terrors of battle and siege, the relentless discomforts of daily life, the crushing weight of financial burdens, the pervasive threat of disease, and the often grim reality behind the code of chivalry. But as the medieval era began its slow, inexorable march towards the dawn of the early modern world, the very foundations upon which knighthood stood began to crumble, not with a sudden cataclysm, but with a gradual yet profound transformation in warfare and society itself. The age of the heavily armored knight, once the undisputed king of the battlefield, was slowly, inevitably drawing to a close, rendered obsolete by innovation and changing power structures. The most significant factor in this decline was a revolution in military technology and tactics. For centuries, the knight on his powerful warhorse, clad in heavy armor and wielding devastating weapons, was the ultimate fighting machine, capable of breaking enemy lines and deciding the fate of battles. His dominance was almost unchallenged. However, a new breed of soldier began to emerge, one that would fundamentally shift the balance of power: the disciplined professional infantrymen. These were not the levies of unwilling peasants, but highly trained, often common-born soldiers who fought in cohesive formations. Pike and spear formations in particular proved to be a formidable counter to cavalry charges. Imagine a phalanx of determined pikemen, their long, sharp spears bristling outwards, forming an impenetrable hedge of steel. A charging knight, no matter how valiant, would find his charge broken, his horse impaled, and himself unhorsed and vulnerable, lost in a sea of infantry that could effectively negate his once unmatched shock power. The days of a single knight effortlessly scattering a horde of foot soldiers were swiftly becoming a relic of the past. But it was another innovation that truly sounded the death knell for knightly dominance: the longbow. First gaining widespread notoriety in the hands of English archers during the 100 Years' War, the longbow was a weapon of terrifying efficiency, with a range far exceeding that of most contemporary crossbows and a much faster rate of fire. A well-trained longbowman could unleash a volley of arrows that rained down upon the enemy with devastating effect. These arrows, tipped with armor-piercing bodkin points, could, from a distance, penetrate the plate armor of even the most heavily armored knights, or at the very least, inflict wounds on their horses, bringing down the mighty steeds and leaving their riders exposed and struggling in the mud. The battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt serve as somber historical lessons, where massed ranks of English longbowmen decimated French chivalry, demonstrating with brutal clarity that courage and heavy armor were no match for a hail of arrows. A knight could no longer simply ride through his enemies. He was now a target, vulnerable to an unseen enemy hundreds of yards away. A chilling reality that transformed the battlefield into a far more lethal and indiscriminate place. And then came the advent of gunpowder. Initially crude and unreliable, early firearms like hand cannons and arquebuses gradually evolved into more potent weapons. While they were slow to load and notoriously inaccurate, they possessed a terrifying power: the ability to punch through steel armor with a single deafening shot. The psychological impact of these loud, smoke-belching weapons was immense, terrifying horses and disorienting men unaccustomed to such concussive force. More crucially, gunpowder revolutionized siege warfare. Massive cannons could now batter down castle walls that had once been considered impregnable. The very fortresses that had symbolized a knight's power and security became vulnerable. No longer could a knight confidently retreat behind stone walls. Even those could now be breached, turning the stronghold into a death trap. This technological leap rendered the traditional military value of a knight, both in open battle and in defense, increasingly diminished. The individual skill and strength that defined knighthood began to matter less than the coordinated fire of gunpowder weapons and disciplined infantry formations. Beyond these military innovations, profound changes in social and political structures also contributed to the decline of knighthood. The feudal system, with its decentralized power structure reliant on individual lords and their knights, began to give way to more centralized monarchies. Kings, increasingly eager to consolidate their power and to reduce their reliance on often rebellious feudal nobles, started to raise and finance professional standing armies. These armies, composed of paid soldiers, could be trained and commanded directly by the crown, offering a loyalty that was often more reliable than that of semi-independent knights who might have their own agendas. The need for a knightly class, bound by oaths of fealty and military service, diminished as monarchs could now levy taxes to pay for professional soldiers, mercenaries, and increasingly specialized units of archers and gunners. The knight, once a vital cog in the feudal machine, found his political and military relevance waning, his role shifting from an indispensable warrior to a more ceremonial or administrative figure. Economically, too, the weight of being a knight became increasingly unsustainable. As we discussed earlier, the cost of armor, weapons, and war horses was immense. With military technology rapidly advancing, knights faced the constant pressure to upgrade their equipment, which only exacerbated their financial burdens. A full suit of plate armor that could withstand a longbow arrow was incredibly expensive. Maintaining a retinue of armed men became even more costly as warfare itself became more professionalized. Many noble families simply could not keep up with these expenses, leading to a decline in their ability to field properly equipped knights. Those who could afford it often became more akin to wealthy cavalry officers within a larger royal army. Rather than independent, feudal warriors, the very economic underpinnings of knighthood, once a source of status and power, gradually transformed into a crippling liability, pushing many noble families into debt and decline. The decline of knighthood, therefore, was not a sudden fall, but a complex, multifaceted process driven by an evolution in weapons, tactics, and political will. It was the gradual erosion of their battlefield dominance by the longbow and gunpowder, coupled with the rise of disciplined infantry. It was the shift from a decentralized feudal system to centralized monarchies with professional armies. It was an economic reality that made the traditional knight increasingly unaffordable and strategically less relevant. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the image of the knight, once a terrifying and awe-inspiring figure, began its transformation into the romanticized, often anachronistic symbol we recognize today. The reality for those living through this transition was one of profound change, of seeing their traditional way of life and their very purpose slowly dissolve into the annals of history. It was the end of an era, a melancholy twilight for a class of warriors whose hardships, in their final years, included the bitter taste of obsolescence. And this, in its own quiet way, also contributed to why, for a medieval knight, the final chapters of their storied existence often deeply, profoundly sucked. Our journey through the external trials of a medieval knight, the brutal training, the chaos of battle, the gnawing hunger, the constant threat of disease, and the eventual erosion of their very purpose, has painted a vivid picture of a life far removed from romantic ideals. Yet, as we approach the final, most intimate layer of their existence, we must now turn our gaze inward, to the hidden costs, the invisible wounds that often inflicted a suffering far more insidious and enduring than any physical injury. For beneath the heavy armor, within the silent chambers of their minds, medieval knights carried burdens that stretched beyond the battlefield, a profound psychological toll that lingered long after the clang of swords had faded. In an era with no concept of post-traumatic stress, no understanding of mental health as we know it today, knights were routinely exposed to horrors that would shatter the psyche of any modern individual. Imagine witnessing, participating in, and perpetrating acts of extreme violence on a regular basis. The screams of the dying, the visceral sight of grotesque wounds, the stench of blood and fear that saturated the air. These were not distant anecdotes, but the daily reality for a man whose profession was warfare. Each battle, each skirmish, each brutal siege would etch itself into the mind, creating a cumulative trauma that found no outlet, no recognition, and certainly no therapeutic intervention. Knights, expected to be unflinching, to display stoicism in the face of death, were forced to internalize these experiences, to suppress the natural human response to such atrocities. This constant exposure, this unceasing engagement with brutality, would inevitably lead to what we now recognize as severe psychological distress, nightmares that offered no escape, a pervasive hypervigilance that made true rest impossible, and a deep-seated anxiety that would shape their perception of the world long after the fighting ceased. This mental burden was further compounded by a profound and pervasive sense of isolation. A knight's life, particularly during long campaigns or when garrisoned in remote castles, often meant vast stretches of time spent away from the familiar comforts of family and community. While we touched on the physical discomforts of travel and living arrangements, consider the emotional void. Weeks, months, or even years could pass without seeing a wife, children, or close kinsmen. Communication was slow, unreliable, and often impossible, leaving them to wonder about the fate of loved ones in a world fraught with danger. Even when in the company of their fellow warriors, the bonds forged in combat were often superficial, built on shared danger rather than deep emotional intimacy. The expectation of unwavering strength and emotional restraint meant that vulnerabilities were rarely shared, and personal struggles were often endured in silence. The very structure of feudal society, with its strict hierarchies and emphasis on duty, often discouraged genuine emotional connection, fostering an environment where a knight, despite being surrounded by people, could feel utterly alone, a solitary figure in a world that demanded constant strength and offered little solace. Moreover, the relentless need for vigilance, a trait honed from childhood training, morphed into a constant gnawing anxiety that permeated every aspect of a knight's existence. Even during periods of official peace, the medieval world remained a dangerous, unpredictable place. Bandits roamed the roads, local feuds could erupt into violence without warning, and the threat of political intrigue or betrayal was ever present. For a knight, his role as a protector and warrior meant his guard could never truly be lowered. Every shadow, every distant sound, every shift in the political wind could signal danger, requiring an immediate response. Imagine the sheer mental exhaustion of living in such a perpetual state of alert, where true relaxation was a foreign concept. Sleep, when it came, would be shallow, punctuated by the internal alarm system of a mind conditioned to detect threat, leaving them perpetually tired, their nerves frayed, and their spirits slowly eroded by the absence of genuine tranquility. This constant internal battle, unseen and unacknowledged by their contemporaries, was perhaps one of the most draining aspects of their demanding lives. The cumulative burden of these factors, the unaddressed trauma of relentless violence, the deep emotional isolation, and the unceasing vigilance, created a psychological landscape of immense hardship. We often view knights through the lens of their external achievements, their bravery, their status. But rarely do we consider the internal world of a man who, from a tender age, was molded into an instrument of war, tasked with facing death, inflicting death, and then expected to return to a semblance of normal life without any emotional processing or support. The physical scars were visible, a testament to their resilience, but the psychological wounds, though hidden, were just as real, often more debilitating and certainly more enduring. These were men who carried the weight of their world, its brutality and its demands, not just on their shoulders, but deep within their very souls, a burden that few could ever truly comprehend or alleviate. This introspective reflection offers a powerful final layer to our understanding of why, for many who bore the title, being a medieval knight was far from the glorious fairy tale often imagined. It was a life that demanded an immense human cost, extracting a toll not just on their bodies and their fortunes, but profoundly on their minds and spirits. It humanizes these figures, allowing us to see them not merely as symbols of an age, but as individuals who grappled with a unique and brutal set of challenges, leaving them with an indelible mark of hardship that defined their very existence. This deeper truth, far from diminishing their story, makes it all the more compelling, all the more poignant, as we acknowledge the silent internal suffering that was an inescapable companion to a life steeped in honor, but also in unyielding hardship and emotional strain. As our exploration draws to a close, we find ourselves gently floating back from the dim, echoing halls of medieval history, carrying with us a far richer, albeit more somber, understanding of the knight's true existence. We embarked on this journey together, lured by the gleaming facade of legend, the tales of honor, valor, and courtly romance that have so long defined our perception of these iconic figures. But tonight, we have dared to peer behind the polished steel, to feel the grit and the grime, to hear the unromantic truths whispered by the passage of time. And in doing so, we have come to a profound realization. The life of a medieval knight, far from being a continuous stream of glory, was an unrelenting gauntlet of hardship, a profound and demanding trial that few of us in our modern world could truly fathom. From the tender age of childhood, their path was one of arduous, often brutal training. We saw how the young page and squire were not merely schooled in martial arts, but forged in a crucible of discipline, physical strain, and demanding servitude, a process that demanded immense personal and financial sacrifice from their families. Their bodies were conditioned, their spirits tested, all in preparation for a life where comfort was rare and peril was omnipresent. Then we plunged into the brutal reality of medieval warfare itself. Not the elegant duels of fiction, but the slow, chaotic, and terrifying melee of open battle, where heavy armor was a burden as much as a shield, and crude weapons inflicted ghastly, often fatal wounds. We lingered in the grinding horror of siege camps, where disease and starvation were more lethal than any enemy blade, and the psychological toll of endless waiting could fray the strongest of wills. Our journey then led us away from the battlefield, into the unsanitized corners of their daily lives. We confronted the pervasive lack of hygiene, the constant irritation of pests, and the bland, often insufficient diets that were their daily bread, a stark contrast to the lavish feasts of legend. We recognized the gnawing monotony of remote garrison duty, the profound isolation from family, and the ceaseless vigilance that prevented true rest, painting a picture of relentless physical and emotional discomfort. Beyond the visible struggles, we uncovered the crippling financial burdens that weighed heavily on knights, the immense cost of armor and horses, the threat of ruinous ransoms, and the complex web of feudal obligations that kept many in perpetual debt. Even the revered code of chivalry, we learned, was often a selective ideal, frequently overshadowed by the pragmatic, brutal realities of power, pillage, and betrayal, revealing a nuanced moral landscape far removed from its romanticized image. And finally, we bore witness to the twilight of their era, as technological and social changes rendered their traditional role obsolete, a melancholic end to a once dominant class. Most intimately, we explored the hidden psychological costs, the unaddressed trauma of constant violence that would today be recognized as PTSD, the deep-seated isolation from loved ones, and the pervasive anxiety of a life lived under perpetual threat. These were the silent battles, fought within the confines of their own minds, leaving indelible scars that no victory or honor could ever truly heal. As we reflect on this sobering legacy, we are reminded that history, in its truest form, is rarely as simple or as glamorous as the stories we tell. The medieval knight, a figure so deeply embedded in our cultural imagination, emerges not as a flawless hero, but as a complex, vulnerable human being, grappling with a world of extraordinary demands and relentless suffering. Their struggles, both physical and psychological, offer a poignant lesson in resilience, adaptation, and the enduring human capacity to survive in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a testament to the fact that even in an age of perceived grandeur, the realities of existence could be profoundly harsh. Now, as the echoes of their story gently fade, and you prepare to drift deeper into rest, I invite you to take a moment. Perhaps this journey through the unvarnished past has offered you a fresh perspective, a quiet contemplation of what truly defines strength and endurance. If this exploration has resonated with you, if it has offered you a moment of peaceful reflection, I invite you to consider a small gesture that extends this journey. Your simple like on this video isn't for me, but for others. It tells the platform that this deep dive into history is meaningful, helping it reach someone else who might be seeking a calm, insightful journey into the past before they drift off to sleep. Imagine your click being a gentle beacon, guiding another curious mind to this quiet understanding. And if you've stayed with us until this very end, if you've immersed yourself in every detail, every nuance of the knight's demanding life, you are truly one of the dedicated explorers of history. As a quiet acknowledgement of your commitment, I invite you to leave a unique mark in the comments below. Write iron resolve to signify your presence, your deep dive into the true nature of medieval knighthood. This isn't just a comment, it's a silent nod to our shared journey, a gentle declaration of your appreciation for the unvarnished truth. If you wish to continue exploring the hidden truths of history, to join a community that values genuine understanding and peaceful learning, consider subscribing to our channel. It's not just a click, it's an invitation to further journeys, to more nights of calm, contemplative discovery. Together, we can continue to uncover the rich, complex tapestry of our past, one peaceful story at a time. For now, let the insights from tonight settle gently into your mind. Feel your body becoming heavier, more relaxed, as the sounds of the medieval world recede entirely. Take a deep, calming breath. Let it all go. Allow this quiet reflection to guide you towards a truly peaceful, restorative sleep. Thank you for joining me on this profound journey through time. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with tranquility and your rest be deep and undisturbed.